Welcome to the Biblical X-Files, where we attempt to connect myths, legends, and conspiracies to a biblical worldview and unpack those overlooked stories in the Bible. So, I got turkey coma.
You can be a little slower tonight.
I might be. They say that happens. So tonight's episode is going to be an overview of giants in America. Let's say the evidence of giants and the evidence of their handiwork, and we're going to call those earthworks. And we're just going to do an overview tonight, and then we'll really unpack these in future episodes. We're going to look at the giants and talk about the ones in America tonight, because the lower 48, so to speak, packed full of giants. Earthworks in the form of mounds, in the forms of serpents and other strange structures that were created by these giants. What if I told you that there's hundreds of news articles, magazine periodicals, and other reports that detail giant bones? And what if I told you that long before America was discovered by Europeans like Columbus or Ponce de Leon or even Leif Erikson, if you believe he came over and inhabited Nova Scotia before anybody else, which I think history bears out, that North America was filled with Nephilim giants all over the place? And what if I told you they were mining precious metals, building cities, and building really strange structures that we'll look at in a few minutes? What if I told you that in the 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, evidence galore, giants, all sorts of strange things, and then in the mid-1900s, it just all stopped? It looks like there was an active movement to suppress giant bones and to re-explain what all these earthworks that we're going to discuss in the mid-40s. And what if I told you that the Smithsonian was the ones behind it? So I asked these questions to just build a base on what we're going to talk about tonight. The evidence of giants and their handiwork. Now, the giants that we're going to talk about are descendants of Nephilim. We've been talking about Nephilim how long now?
This whole show.
Pretty good bit, right? So these, if you want to use a biblical verse, what we're going to talk about tonight are the mighty men of old and the men of renown. Remember how Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, as it talks about the sons of God, Bein Elohim, it ends it out with the mighty men of old and the sons of renown. But that's what we're going to look at tonight, these offspring of the original Nephilim, because the original Nephilim were before the flood. These are kind of the offspring. We went over it last episode, all the giants in the Bible, and you'll see evidence of King Og's Amorites here in the United States when we break down these earthworks and these mounds and the evidence of giants in future episodes. I don't think we'll get there tonight, but we will get there eventually. I think there's three things that we're going to look at that really provide evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, so to speak, that giants, Nephilim, existed, and they were all over the United States before it was the United States. We have newspaper articles. Newspaper articles are citing eyewitness accounts of these giant bones. Also, there's photographic evidence taken by the newspaper, case in point, New York Times, that show the giant bones in the 1800s and in the early 1900s. You have the bones themselves. That's pretty good evidence. When you see a femur that long, well, that's not mine. That's not a 6-foot dude. And when you have a skull that's 4 times the size of a human skull and shaped weirdly different, and we're going to show some photographs of those as we get into the different giants where they inhabited parts of the West Coast, the desert areas of America, down through Texas, and they were really occupied Illinois, Ohio, over to the East Coast, thousands of them. And then there's a thing called earthworks. And earthworks are strange structures that these giant Nephilim created. Some of them will resemble a pyramid. Some of them look like a ziggurat. Some of them look like just a big mound, and other ones look like serpents. All sorts of strange things that really nobody can explain their origin. Well, they say Native Americans created them, but Native Americans say they were here when we got here. So you can find 55 articles from the New York Times, still from microfilm and people who had cut them out and just kept them through the years, on giant bones. Now, we're not going to go over all those tonight, but I do want to read you a few headlines. Also, mining companies out west and down into Mexico took impeccable details of what they were mining for all the investors, and they log in giant bones, strange artifacts, all sorts of things like that. And when the railroad was going from the east to west, they have a plethora of information. In fact, we're going to look at one detailed account where some railroad men had to fight a giant out in Nevada. So that's going to be interesting in a future episode, and that's straight out of their journals. And I don't think that they would lie about that and send it back east and say, hey, pay me more money because we're fighting giants. That was just detailed in there on their detailed daily log. Hey, we had to fight Indians, we had to fight giants, we had to fight this and that. So it's all there, it's in writing. Let me just share with you a few of the headlines from the New York Times. I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to give you a few. Here, Dateline, November 21st, 1856. Skeleton of giant found. Dateline, December 25th, Merry Christmas. 1868, reported discovery of a huge skeleton 3 times the size of a human. Dateline, July 10th, 1883, a graveyard of giants is discovered. Dateline, April 5th, 1888, monster skulls and bones discovered in Ohio. Dateline, June 30th, 1888, the skeletons of a former race discovered. Giant race, not us. Dateline, August 10th, 1891, Wisconsin mounds, which we were going to talk about, that's an earthwork, discovered. September 27th, the same year, gives a description of what was found inside the mounds, and I give you one guess what they found.
Giant bones.
There you go. Give that man a prize. There you go. Lots of other things too, but the giant bones were amazing and were found in that article. Dateline, December 19th, 1904, so now we're in the 1900s. A giant race discovered in Greenland. Dateline, December 25th, 1904. It says a new giant race discovered, different than the ones that was discovered in the 1800s. So you kind of see that there's a little bit of difference within the giant height and what they found within their grave. There's some commonality with all of them, but some of them have some unique artifacts that we're going to dig into later, showing where they came from. January 27th, 1914, giants found in China. Here's an interesting one, and we have photos, and we're going to probably have a half an episode on this guy. Dateline, July 16th, 1916. Human skulls found with horns.
Okay.
Yeah. Very strange. The photos are very strange, and they have been authenticated. It's not a hoax, and we're going to get into hoaxes later. But this was authenticated, and it was an actual human skull with horns. And you'll notice in some of the photos later how they're elongated skulls in the back. It almost looks like an alien head. And when you look at them, you're going to say, that's an alien, that's a fake alien, but it's really a Nephilim giant. So let me give you a couple more real quick, and then we'll move on. July 12th, 1925, giants must have survived the age of fable, whatever that means, because evidence abounds of North American giants. Dateline, May 14th, 1926, 10-foot giant unearthed in Michigan. And when we read about that giant, you're going to find out that he was very unique what those giants in Michigan were up to. So one more article here. I found this one interesting. January 29th, 1947, giant bones found in Russia. So you start to see they're found in Europe, they're found in Russia, they're found in South America, they're found in Mexico, Asia, Middle East, wherever there's humans, there's giants. It's kind of weird that the Nephilim stayed where there's human beings. Let me read you an article, just a couple of selected articles. And I selected this one from 1916, dateline July 14th, but it's because it's from a city I used to live in, Binghamton, New York. When I was a child, my dad had a church there, and I lived there. So when I read this article, I could picture what they're talking about because I've been there. But when I was a kid, nobody talked about giants. Let me read it to you. It said, the article says, Binghamton, July 13th. Professor A.B. Skinner of the American Indian Museum, Professor W.K. Moorhead of the Phillips Andover Academy, and Dr. George Donahue, Pennsylvania State Historian, all three have been conducting research along the valley of the Susquehanna and uncovered a large Indian mound on the Murray Farm. In the mound, uncovered were bones of 68 men. It is believed that it is over 700 to 1,000 years ago that these bones were buried. The average height was 8 foot tall, and some much, much taller. That's the article. So, New York Times, dateline December 20th, 1897. I gave you this one to show you how the miners and the railroad people kept meticulous records and discovered a lot of things, because we're going to get into a lot of those records later. Giant skeletons found in cave in Mexico. The cave gives up the bones of an ancient race. Charles C. Clapp, who recently returned from Mexico, where he has been in charge of the Thomas W. Lawson mining interest, has called to the attention to Professor M.G. Agassiz, and he showed him a remarkable discovery. Mr. Clapp found in Mexico a cave containing 200 skeletons, each men above 8 foot in height, some larger, kind of like the one up in the Susquehanna Valley on the border of New York and Pennsylvania. Mr. Clapp arranged these bones for photographs. All of them averaged about 8 foot 11 inches, with some much taller. So there you see, there's bones. I mean, to me, that's evidence that giants existed. I mean, they're printing it in the news. Back then, you could trust the news.
Wow, I don't even know what that feels like being my age.
I mean, you would think this is fake news, but it's not. This is true news. What we have now may be a little bit different. But these articles go on and on and on. But then you hit 1940, right about the middle of 1940, and giants just off the record, just gone, just disappear. Since 1947, the giant bones that are being discovered are instantly discredited by the Smithsonian, instantly discredited by the main universities who have big anthropology departments. They just call it a hoax. If you believe in giants, put on your tin hat, because you believe in all kind of other crazy conspiracies as well. But this is what I say. I believe that a conspiracy is taken. There's a conspiracy afoot, so to speak. But it's not with people finding bones. It's with the organizations that are trying to suppress them for whatever reason. All right, so unfortunately, there have been some hoaxes. There have been people who have used petrified wood and plaster of Paris to make these gargantuan 35-foot giants, and they put them in the dirt and dig them up and act as if they found a giant. That hurts the cause of people who really find real giant bones. So really, I want everybody to know that here at the Biblical X-Files, we do everything we can to vet the information that we give you. We want to be a reliable, trusted source of information. So what we tell you, we vetted and we trust the sources. In fact, this right here is a book I highly recommend. It's by Fritz Zimmerman, and it's called The Encyclopedia of Giants. This man here spent 50 years of his life investigating earthworks, giants in America, and everything that he has in here is verified. He doesn't put hoaxes in his work because he has a reputation to keep. And I'd love to be able to talk to him one day, because he's an amazing scholar on giant bones, earthworks in America. He knows about them all over the world, but his specialty is right here in this country. So, Logan, Any questions on what we talked about before we move on?
No, we're just pushing through.
We're
I'm
just
liking
pushing
it.
through.
I'm
All right.
liking it.
Okay. So, Nephilim, these giants, they're occupying the United States before the United States is ever discovered by a European explorer. Do you know what earthworks are?
Are you like, so basically it's, from my understanding so far, it's these works that are found all around the world in different countries that are mysterious in how they were made, essentially.
Yes. Mysterious in how they're made and what they're used for.
Yeah, right.
So the first slide we have right here is from Miamisburg. It's called the Miamisburg Mound, and it is in Ohio, and it looks just like a pyramid. See that dirt earthworks of a pyramid. I don't want to be redundant, but I'm going to say it now, and I'm going to say it over and over again. All the scholars now say Indians created these. But how could an Indian with a shovel and a pickaxe, hunters and gatherers, use geometry, bring in millions of metric tons of dirt, pile it up that way, and it still be here today?
I find that unlikely.
Very, very unlikely. Now, the second slide here of Moundsville, West Virginia, this mound is so predominant, they named a city after it. Kind of looks like, to me, Dr. Seuss's hat. It's kind of wobbly. It's kind of like they were trying to build some sort of a pyramid, but they rounded off the top. Now, what's unique about this place is there's a museum out on the outside boundary, not in the photo. And once upon a time, you could actually go down into that mound and see how it was constructed.
Oh, wow.
With megalithic rocks, and it was some sort of nobody really knows. Some people say it's a burial spot because some bones were discovered. Some people think that it could be used for other things. These pyramids and these round mounds they do line up with some of the zodiac, but they don't really have, it's hard to say that they line up with solstices and that sort of thing, because sure. the first one does because of the cardinal points on it, but this round one, it's kind of an anomaly. But it was all these dates. Let's just go ahead and throw this out there so I don't have to repeat myself. Between 500 BC and 1000 BC, every one of your slides that you're going to look at in this episode, that's the time frame that they can date it back to. So they're very old. The Etowah Indian Mounds, you can see how tall it is. They built a bridge so you can go tour it today. This isn't something that was built in the 40s. It goes back to maybe before 1000 BC. They started off it's about 1000 BC when this base of this ziggurat was built, because that's what it used to be on top of it.
Quick question: could you define a ziggurat?
Yeah, that is like a pyramid with the steps, like the Mayans.
Yep.
Okay, it's the same thing that the Tower of Babel. It wasn't a Tower of Babel wasn't a round watchtower like
a cell tower or something.
Yeah, it wasn't like a round tower that Jimi Hendrix sings about all along the watchtower that goes straight up. It was more of a pyramid, but has the steps going up, and then instead of a point, they're flat on top. That's the only difference between the two are the steps on the outside leading to the flat top. A pyramid goes straight up to the And we're going to get into why we believe some are flat and some are pointed.
Interesting.
And so we'll get into that in a future episode, because it is something that I think needs to be talked about. But that's just the pyramid, ziggurat, odd earthworks in the form of what they call mounds. If you Google them, they're going to be called Indian mounds, because that's what the government has assigned to them. But if you do your research, you will find out that 99 of 100 Indian tribes that have mounds will say they were here when we got here. The gods built them.
Sure.
Okay? So in America, and really all over the world, you have these earthworks. You have these megalithic rock formations like Stonehenge in England. But right down in England, you still have a thing that looks eerily similar to the Moundsville, and we're going to connect those two together in a future episode, and we're going to connect the Serpent Mound in Ohio to Stonehenge in England. I'll briefly talk about it tonight, but we're going to show you the real similarities in future episodes. And then you have these pyramids and these ziggurats and the bases for them all over America. You have them all over Central America, all over Asia, all over the Middle East. Any questions on any of that real quick? Or?
Nope.
All right, so let's keep rocking and rolling. So have you ever heard of the Serpent Mound?
Well, I saw the pictures before this episode, and obviously it's well named. It's very, very obviously representing a serpent in the shape.
You can see the one in America, which is the Great Serpent Mound. It's the best one that you can actually go see anywhere in the world. There's only 3 of them, but the one that's the best is here in America, and that is what's called the Great Serpent Mound. But you have 3 earthworks that are in the form of a serpent eating an egg in 3 different places in the world. One is in Ohio, one is in Ontario, Canada, and the other is in Scotland.
Can you pause for 1 second? Each one of those serpents all have an egg in the mouth?
Yes. All the serpents of the 3 earthworks are, you'll see clearly on the one that we have the arrows pointing to from in Ohio, but the serpent mouth is open and it's trying to eat an egg.
Okay, interesting. So my initial thought on that is it's not only significant just as an isolated event, each individual earthwork, like, wow, why was this here? Who did this? When did they do this? Why did they do this? That's interesting. But what's also really interesting to me is why is there common themes throughout different parts of the world that, based on the timing that they actually were made, why do they have similarities like that? Like a snake with an egg, that's a pretty specific image, right? It could have just been a snake. Of course, it would make a lot more sense if it was just a snake because that's a very common symbol. But with the egg, that adds like a whole layer of just bizarre. I mean, it's just bizarre to me. That's a whole new layer of like unlikeliness.
It is very bizarre.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And we're going to talk about that, a little bit of the significance of the egg later on in this episode. And then we're really going to talk about the significance of the egg in future episodes because all 3 of them are clearly eating an egg or trying. Let me point out, they're trying to eat the egg. These serpent mounds have posed a big problem for mainstream historians and archaeologists because they don't fit any narrative that they want to go back and with history. This rewrites history as we know it. And so they just, instead of plugging it into history and making it work, they just decide to avoid it. Because there's a lot, and we'll get into it more when we talk about the Smithsonian cover-up, and it'll really make sense on why all this is being covered up, in my opinion, and it's pretty obvious that it's covered up. UFOs, earthworks, Stonehenges are all in conspiracy theory, weird people only going to fall for this. But that's how they want to discredit the truth. If they can say this guy's crazy because he's trying to say that this serpent mound was created not by the Indians but by someone else, some interdimensional being, they've got to be crazy, so don't listen to them. Don't listen to anything they got to say. And that's been going on since the 40s. But now with technology, which there is a good thing with technology, you can prove that this stuff's legit and you can really narrow down and look at who created them. So I have 2 questions I want you and I to consider before we move on, and I want the listeners and the audience to think about this as well as you look at this serpent mound and we talk about it. How could a primitive hunt and gatherer Indian, the indigenous Americans that were here before Europeans, even Europeans that come over on boats back in that age, how could they create this serpent across 1,500 feet or more, geometrically shaped, when the Native Americans had no idea about geometry, trigonometry? They didn't have surveying equipment. How could they make this the way it looks and be perfectly rounded and it not erode since 1000 BC? And the American Indians weren't here yet then. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit that narrative that the Indians created it. They didn't have the technology nor the equipment to move that much dirt and megalithic rocks in to create it.
It's not just dirt, obviously.
No, and they didn't. The one in Scotland that we're going to talk about, They really went in and really studied it before they put everybody out. The one in America has been studied, but we just have it's hard to find information on what was found within the serpent itself. Let's say Indians created the one in Ohio. The same group of Indians put the same thing up in Ontario. How do you explain the one in Scotland being built at the same time in Europe?
I don't think you can.
Well, you can't connect those
mean-
dots. That's a stretch.
Yeah.
That is a stretch. If American Indians created it, then did they get on a boat, go over to Scotland, invade Scotland, build a serpent mound, get on their boat, and sail back? I don't think so.
I'm not
It
buying it.
just couldn't happen. So it's really important for us to understand that these three serpent mounds are also near what they call impact craters. The one in Ohio, the one in Canada, and the one in Scotland, all three are built on a ridge, and all three have what they call impact craters. The scientists and the people out there want to say that a meteor hit, made the impact, and then 300 to 500 years later, the earthwork was created. That could be, but could it be some sort of fight between Nephilim? You know, because these guys, if we think that Nephilim always got along with each other, that would be wrong.
Right.
You know, so they don't always get along with each other. And so they could have had some kind of big battle, and there was a big indentation made by the Nephilim creature, the Nephilim giants, during battle. There are some people, as we speak, exploring Peru who are trying to trace back to Nephilim an actual small-scale nuclear explosion.
And where? And you said it's in Peru.
It's in Peru, and as soon as they get their findings out, we'll know. But some people think that that could be something very similar to what happened, some sort of huge explosion by some kind of interdimensional weapon that we don't know about that caused these impacts where these serpent mounds are.
Well, that certainly will have to be suppressed pretty heavily, because if you start talking about nuclear or even anything similar in scale or in kind going off, that's clearly a historic site where the technology clearly wasn't there at the time. That's questionable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's crazy that it's kind of crazy that we even say, well, it could be an interdimensional weapon that made the crater. What's the odds of 3 asteroids hitting on a ridge where 3 serpent mounds are built? 3 earth mounds made by Native Americans, and they had technology that was good for them at the time. It's not that we're not saying that they're ignorant. Any European couldn't have made these either. There's nobody in that time frame could have used the instruments that they had, a shovel and a pick, maybe, and move that much dirt and those huge, big, huge megalithic rocks that weigh tons and tons and tons, can move them in and do all that and make it just the way it looks. As you can see how it looks, you can tell that is by an intelligent design.
Sure.
And
I almost question the reason just as much as the ability, right? Like, the reason is also very unlikely to put that much effort. So, like, let's say just for a second that they did have the proper technology to do this, which seems doubtful, right? Even if they did, there still has to be a good enough reason to justify such an abnormally intensive process to construct something like that with such advanced mathematics involved and, again, extremely heavy materials. You have to ask, other than just a cosmetic, because clearly a snake is not a, I can't imagine they would have created that for a cosmetic, like they were doing some kind of park or something for their civilians to play on or something. I'm pretty sure that amount of effort would have to warrant a bizarre level of motivation that's not just for military use or for recreational use. There has to be something there that's, to me, also, again, very unlikely considering how long ago it was and how it would have been challenging to build with what they had at the time.
Even in their folklore or whatever you want to call it, they don't like snakes either, the Native Americans. Nobody likes snakes. It's kind of been that way since the serpent fell from walking up and was cursed to eat the dust, according to Genesis, always have something sinister about them. So they kind of apply this earthwork that looks like a serpent to the evil side of their ancestor and spiritual beliefs. And they didn't go there for, like, to pay homage to this to the serpent. It was this
Right.
That was part of the evil. It kind of scared them. They didn't like it. And maybe if they went to it, they would try to draw power for it for a battle or something like that. But this wasn't something that they were very fond of. It's a serpent eating
So
an
you're
egg.
saying it wouldn't have been the mainstream to create that. So the fact that it even would have been built in the first place by a small minority that they would deem kind of the evil people at the time. So even if they were the ones that created it, the fact that it wouldn't have been contested from the mainstream, which are people who didn't support that kind of imagery. Because I feel like I'm pretty historically illiterate, but I will say that it seems like in my memory, it feels like the Egyptians played with the serpent imagery a good bit.
They did.
Yep.
A lot of cultures did.
Yes, they did, but it's like, again, if you look at the actual location where these serpents were put there, I don't even know how to even explain, constructed, built, whatever. You've got to think, was that in the mainstream for it to be that much of an initiative to go through that much labor and that much time and dedication and mathematical striving to create something that intricate and challenging? If that wouldn't be the mainstream symbolism at the time, that's also another question mark. Like, why would they have spent that much resources and time and energy into something that's not even like a mainstream? Like, it would make sense if it was a giant relic that the mainstream would either worship or use for any sort of practical application. But this is just a snake on the ground with an egg in its mouth, like with the egg in front of its mouth. Like, that's just why would they do that?
Kind of weird.
Yeah.
The only exception to that would be in the Greeks and in the Roman time, but the Greeks had the Greek god in their pantheon, Asclepius, and that's where you have on the medical, how ambulance is in the medical symbol is a staff with the snake going around it? That's where that originated from, because those false priests would lay you down in the floor, and all these thousands of snakes were in there, and if one of those snakes slithered across you, then they said you would be healed. Okay, so that would be the only exception to snakes being, nasty and nefarious. Or some cultures would think of snakes as a healing mechanism, especially it was part of the Greek pantheon. But that doesn't apply to what we're looking at here, because it's not the snake with the going
Right.
up. This
Totally
is
different
This is
image.
a snake eating an egg.
Yeah, that's a very specific thing.
And-
Again, if it was just a snake, that's more understandable. But the specific logo of having an egg there, that begs a whole new question of why.
Now, this particular earthwork in America, this serpent mound is what it's called, the serpent mound. I think I told you it's about 1,500 feet long from the tail to where it curls. If you go all the way up to the mouth, it's about 1,500 feet plus the egg. This particular earthwork, because not all the earthworks you can line up with the equinoxes, but this here in America, the earthwork of the serpent mound lines up exactly with the solstices, the way Stonehenge in England lines up. The same thing that the Nephilim would look at during the solstices with Stonehenge using megalithic rocks, they would do at the serpent mound here in the United States. Those two are connected somehow with the solstices.
Okay. And why? What is the significance of them potentially being connected to the solstices?
There's a lot of conjecture out there. We're going to probably get into that later when we look at Stonehenge individually.
Okay.
And the mounds. And there's three theories that I think are plausible, and you probably already heard of one of them about extra-dimensional portals.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other two are a little bit different, and we can get into that later. Like I said before, you got to remember these are on ridges and they have impact craters, and that's what makes them unique. And these serpent mounds are very unique in origin, on who built them, why they built them, and the characteristics of the serpent mound itself, and the things that are around it, like giant bones, craters, all these sort of things. They all you have to look at that in its totality when you're trying to figure out what this serpent mound means. So let's look at the Loch Ness serpent, which is the one in Scotland. It's the second one down on our. You'll have a picture of it up there. It was first explored by a guy named J.S. Fierce in 1871, and this is excerpt from his report. He says, under the head, where that head meets the snake, where the mouth is open and it's going into the snake, he said he discovered large rocks, kind of rooted around through them, and found a chamber that led down into the serpent's mouth underneath. You could say you're in the belly of the snake. Down in the belly of the snake, he discovered megalithic rocks that formed a chamber, and in the chamber contained burnt bones. And now, some say that he said giant bones. Some say he just said bones. It could be both,
Sure.
I don't know. Charcoal and hazelnuts. This is the first time hazelnuts comes into play. And still looking at some theories on why hazelnuts are found in a couple of these serpent mounds and why they're found in certain earthworks and not in others. And that could be different tribes of giants, the way they did certain things. They used the hazelnuts for whatever ritual, while other giants didn't. We're still looking into that. I want to come up with something that a little bit better than just some freaky ideas people have. I'd like to find some more writings on that before we go deep into it. Now, there's a lady named Constance Gordon Cumming. She described the Loch Ness serpent in two books. One she was written in 1872, titled Good Words. She mentions it again in 1883 in a book she calls He-Birds, whatever that means. I don't know. So, but she talks about, she went out and explored it and talked to Mr. Fierce, and she said it is a huge serpent-shaped mound, very remarkable in construction, with no rises or indentations. It is smooth all the way around. Now, she's looking at this in the 1800s, and it's built in 1000 BC, and she's talking about how immaculate of a construction it is. Kind of strange. She talks about it forming a serpent, like it's coiled up, eating an egg. What a reptile is how she finished her. She just said, what a reptile. And then she just went off to something else she was talking about. But it's documented, all the way back to the 1800s. So these guys, these earthworks are almost identical in construction, how they position, and on a ridge near these craters. So why is the serpent eating an egg? One theory, and I want to give you the two theories that I believe are why that are the most plausible, because they got some people out there, if you Google this, they think we're crazy. They come up with it. They just make up stuff, but they can't prove it. It's just what their idea. So we like I said, we try to keep things on the up and up. So one theory the two theories that I think make a lot of sense is one of the theories that the Nephilim, in building this serpent trying to eat an egg, is referencing what's called Orphicism. And Orphicism comes from Greek mythology from 500 BC, where Orpheus is a legendary singer. He is a crooner of all crooners. He could sing and make the rocks melt and trees bend, and he could get everybody to do anything he wanted just because of his majestic voice. He was so good at singing that he slipped past that three-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades and rescued his wife because she had died and went to Hades, and he needed to get her out because it was a place of punishment. He didn't want her there. And so he could sing his way past the three-headed dog that guarded Hades. The Greeks borrowed this ritual, or this, what you want to call this singing of this guy, and made a religion out of it. And it says this, they say that the egg and the death is the soul is the egg, and the serpent is evil trying to eat the egg. But the singer can croon away and make it so the egg can't be swallowed by evil. So Nephilim could be saying, "Hey, look, we're here to help you, with this egg." If you're trying to find real imagery and why they did it, but really it boils down to Genesis 3:15, very first episode when we said two seeds were at war against each other. He said, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring." Remember that offspring comes from the word seed in the Greek Septuagint in the Old Testament. That sperm, we got the two DNAs and all that. The serpent has long been a symbol of evil in almost all cultures, and especially within the Bible. From the beginning of time, and if you think about Genesis chapter 3, the snake is called evil, sneaky, crafty, deceptive, and he's our adversary. Peter calls him a roaring lion, but the snake is our adversary. When you think of eggs, when you think of it back in the Old Testament times, the New Testament times, even now, really, egg is the beginning of life. It is a place where life emerges, okay? It is a type of incubation. An egg, much like a woman carrying a child, the egg has, something's forming in there, and that very fragile shell is what's protecting what's forming inside that egg. It is a stage of infancy. And I think this is the warring seeds that we're the egg, we're God's race, and this serpent's trying to eat us. But I find it ironic that Nephilim didn't put that snake in his mouth and down into his belly all the way down. Nephilim, as smart as they were, couldn't come up. They had to make something ironic, showing it that we win.
Yeah, the right in front of the. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I mean, yeah, that could be a whole conversation as to why. I mean, you could clearly still tell, and perhaps maybe they were just trying to preserve the image of understanding what it was going into the mouth, because I think you could obviously depict a snake with like the thick part in the neck where you can clearly tell like down in its belly,
right?
Which for a snake is basically like its neck, like right but below the mouth, inside the mouth, you could make it where it's obviously
they could have made an obvious egg out of it, showing it,
but you could misinterpret that though. You could think that that's like a mouse or some kind of like small rodent or some kind of animal.
I guess.
I understand an egg is rounded, but
how about just a little bit? I don't know. I don't know why. I just find it unique, the egg. Okay, now, we'll get into this in future episodes, but part of that egg in that structure has copper. Some of it has copper in there. And some people believe that was, it's a lightning catcher.
Interesting.
And
okay. So it served more than just the purpose of creating an image.
Yeah, there's some kind of imagery there.
Yep.
I would like to figure out what the imagery is, and I would like to really know the whole purpose of it, because everything that Nephilim did and everything that Nephilim will do in the future has symbolism and it has meaning behind it, and it's for an end game. They're not going to spend time building pyramids, earthworks, serpent mounds as art. It's a means to an end for them, and I would like to figure out what that means to an end represents. And I think it's doable if we can find the right evidence to piece together. Right now, we have a lot of pieces of that puzzle, but we don't have the main pieces yet that kind of like, boom, there it is. But we hope that over time, we can find this information and come up with a really good idea on what it represents, what it did represent. And if it's still here today, and Jesus says it's going to be like the days of Noah and Nephilim created it, then I think my personal belief is that there's something, because they've stood the test of time. Are they going to be used for something in the end? We're always thinking of the technology and all this teleporting, all this crazy quantum computing that's going to happen in the end, that's going to be part of that, I think, the master plan of Satan in the very end when Nephilim is walking among us, which I believe they already are. But sometimes old school stuff works better than new school stuff.
Yeah.
Like if the
Well,
if the EP blows up, your cell phone won't work.
right. Well, and not only is it just old school, it was clearly at its time not old school, right?
Right.
And it was the opposite. It was really something completely, just because again it's made out of dirt and rocks, that's easy to write it off as saying there's no technology there. That's just a raw materials based structure. But what we forget, the same thing with the Tower of Babel. What were they putting in there that made it so dangerous? Again, it was like the technology involved with all these earthworks and even the ones found in the Bible. You have to ask what is different about them, and it's clearly to me, what's clear is that the Bible shows the difference in the flood and in the Tower of Babel. Both instances, God had to stop something that was happening that wasn't just a difference in degree when it comes to the technology. It was a difference in kind. So it was a completely different kind of technology that God did not want and that ultimately he had to stop because it had power that was beyond human ability. And that's, I think that's obviously true with whatever the heck these structures were, these earthworks. They were for something beyond cosmetics to me.
Absolutely. Same with you mentioned Tower of Babel. This is something everybody needs to go Google. The EU headquarters that opened up a couple years ago, I think it opened up during the COVID, so nobody didn't really get a lot of play. They replicated it, the EU headquarters, after the Renaissance painting of what the Renaissance believed the Tower of Babel looked like. And they even say it is the Tower of Babel. Our building represents the Tower of Babel. It's in their brochures. And the stars that, the EU flag has the stars that represent each country that make up the EU. On the original brochure, make sure you Google the original brochure for the grand opening of the EU headquarters. Look at those stars close, and you'll see that it's a pentagram.
Oh, gosh.
That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just right there in front of you. It's just right in front of your face.
Whoa. That's crazy. I didn't even know about the Tower of Babel thing like you're talking about.
Yeah, and so
you didn't get play because COVID was the only thing we were talking about.
And I didn't think about telling you about it in the last episode until you just jogged my memory saying, things of old and new, they all have significance. And I thought, well, they did that too. So,
wow.
So, yeah,
That's
I don't know. They did summon some court of power that we can't do today. And it was a earth and serpent. And like, if it lines up with the solstices like Stonehenge and King Og's henge over from the biblical times, then it could be portal opening, and maybe you stand on the egg and that's how they go. I don't know. Like I said, there's just so many things. It's just conjecture, and we're going to get into all the conjecture on it. I just find it really weird that a serpent represents Satan, and we have one in the United States, in Ohio, eating an egg.
Yeah. And that there's two others in other countries, Canada, and then where was the other one?
Canada and Scotland.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Yeah, and they can't be created by Indians. And I don't think, most of the Indian cultures say, when we came here, this is what we inherited. The gods either created it for us or gods were fighting, and they killed each other off, and we're just occupying their homeland. They didn't create them. They didn't even try to replicate a small one. At least the Egyptians tried to replicate some of the pyramids that they discovered, because I believe the main pyramid was built by Nephilim. But the American Indians decided they didn't have time for that. They had too much stuff to do to try to build a civilization than to mess around with that.
Yeah, that sounds that sounds reasonable. So where does this leave us? So we've talked about the mounds in this episode. We've talked about we've kind of introduced the term earthworks, and that's something that we're going to elaborate in future episodes. What are these earthworks? And we're going to hopefully go to some of those in person. And again, that's another huge reason we ask that you guys please subscribe to the channel. That helps us build this channel and its audience so that we can actually get permits, we can get permissions to go to these interesting places and have the credibility to actually get in the door with some of these people. We want to interview people that are subject matter experts. We want to go to these different places that may even be on private property or just very hard to access, these locations all around the world. Obviously, we'll start here in the United States because weirdly enough, there's seemingly plentiful opportunities just here in our backyard to go explore these interesting places. So beyond that, what can we look for next episode before we close this one out tonight?
Next episode, we're going to dig deeper into the earthworks and the strange structures that are left behind, the handiwork of Nephilim, and what it could mean. As some of these, I believe, are semiconductors that harness power to open portals. Some open portals to like other dimensions. Some of these megalithic rock structures, the way they line up with the zodiac, and when you read historical accounts of what went on there before, after Nephilim, and if you listen to these fables and you'll listen to these stories coming from around the world, you can find truth in there. What they say was the origination of these structures and stuff like that. Some of them, I believe, and I believe that there's a lot of people believe this as well, that not only do they open up dimensions to open up portals to other dimensions that are, where Nephilim and Satan and everybody exists, it also opens up a portal, so to speak, where the beam me up Scotty type stuff, to where you can go from Scotland. Let's say you could go from Scotland, the mouth of the serpent in Scotland, to the mouth of the serpent in Ohio at the blink of an eye, when the conditions were right.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's when we start looking at, when I say that these giants were into mining copper and mining tin and stuff like that, because there's mines that have hundreds and thousands of metric tons of ore missing from them when they were discovered. It was obviously mined out of these shafts in ways that the miners that were going in, like, how did they do this? Do we think that they took it and put it on a wooden boat and sailed it back over to different parts of the Middle East or wherever King Og was? Do we think that that's how they did it? You would think we would have some journals on that. I think that they just from here to there. I mean, some people believe that the giants came from Europe, came from the Middle East, up through Europe, across the land bridge, and walked their way down. And we're going to get into some writing that was interpreted from some. You have copper scrolls, and you have a stone, almost like it's a marble slab that's 10 foot by 12 foot, that has some of the most unique writing on it, and depending on how you interpret it, what it says. Because of the way the letters are, it could be early Samaritan, it could be early Greek, before the Greek that the Bible was written in. It could be King Og's language, and it can be a combination of all three. And when you read the combination of all three, when a linguist looked at it and said, this is three languages intermixed together, and this is what it says, bingo. That's going to be the next episode. That's crazy what it says.
So we're going to unpack what these structures may be doing, what their purpose may have been back then, and perhaps what it will be again.
And we're going to talk about the artifacts that are found in there that can. Zimmerman does a great job at this. Artifacts that are found in some of the earthworks and mounds here in America trace all the way back to Nimrod and trace all the way back to King Og.
Wow.
You can trace it straight back to them. Both of them were what? They were Nephilim giants. And so they were here and they were there. And how they can't be everywhere. They're not savoir faire. The cartoon, he's everywhere. Now, that he can't, that's not what, these giants can't be everywhere at one time, but they can travel pretty quick to make you think they can be everywhere at one place. Will that happen in the future with Nephilim, when Nephilim returns, when it will be like the days of Noah? I bet you it is. I bet you that's how they use these old structures. They'll juice them up and make them look a little bit cooler for the modern era, but they will use the same thing that they used them for then, they'll use them for in the future.
So perhaps that's an older version of their now UAPs, UFO technology. That's an older, more direct, Earth-based thing where it's actually rooted physically on Earth as opposed to being
you hit it.
Flight-based.
Earthworks move you on the Earth from one place to the other. All right? And certain earthworks open up portals to where you can travel straight through. And then they have the UAPs, the UFOs that they're flying back and forth in now. And in order to bring them in, they're using the UFO. I believe that they're using the UFO spaceship. We see them. They're aliens. That's how they're going to explain themselves this time, coming as saviors of the universe before Satan tried to inflict his power through force with giants. And it didn't work because a Nephilim can die if you can, and if you eventually, you know, with God's help, humans killed them in the Middle East and ran them off. That's why I believe they came to America and inhabited America away from all that, getting stronger, and then would go back and do whatever. He didn't succeed with force, so he's coming back this time as the Savior, which he's a counterfeiter. There's only one Savior of the universe. He's Jesus Christ. He was crucified on the cross. He died. He rose again in 3 days. He ascended into heaven. That's the only Savior of the universe. But he's going to counterfeit the Savior of the universe, and he's going to do it with Nephilim.